All right. Today is October 25th, and again, I hope you have your calculators out. You'll want them. Make sure you're doing it right on your calculator. All right. We've been studying quadratic equations. A quadratic equation is anything that has an x squared in it. And the past few days, we've been doing completing a square for 3 days, so I hope you've got it. We're only spending 1 day on the quadratic formula, okay? Completing a square and the quadratic formula work all the time. But we did learn 2 other methods, factoring and by taking square roots, that also work. But they only work some of the time, okay? So to know the quadratic formula or completing the square is essential. You have to know one of them so that you can solve every quadratic equation, okay? So here it is. Get this written down, ladies and gentlemen, all of it. The quadratic formula. The solutions to the equation ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. Very important that it's set equal to 0. Steady. All right. If it's set equal to 0, then we can solve for x, which is why it says x equals. We're solving for x, all right? We can plug everything into this formula. B is the number in front of the x term, A is the number in front of the x squared term, and C is the constant that's added on the end. These all mean multiply, so we're going to use our calculators to plug this thing in. This stuff under the radical is called the discriminant. And we're going to plug that in using our calculator. Makes the process a lot easier, I think. Just make sure you always use parentheses, okay? So be careful. This formula is absolutely essential that you memorize. So there's a nice little song. Are you ready? We're going to sing it a lot today, okay? All right, here goes. X equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. All right, that was the tune to Pop Goes the Weasel. And it really, really helps if you actually sing it, okay? You've got to learn it. You've got to have it memorized. Right here in front, it is the opposite of b. Don't think that it's negative b, all right? Do not think that it's negative b. It is the opposite of b. So whatever your b value is, you change the sign. The opposite of b. It does not mean negative b, so make sure you keep that in mind. All right. Are you doing okay? Yeah. You go there? No? Oh, okay. All right. Here we go. So make sure you know your quadratic formula. We're going to use it a lot today. Here we go. Example 1, the quadratic formula to solve the equation. Use the quadratic formula. All right. So to get started, I'm going to write down the quadratic formula every single time. X equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. I suggest you write it down until you have it memorized. It's a little monotonous, but hopefully you'll memorize it quickly. Before we can use the formula, we have to know what the a and the b and the c are. So first of all, my equation is set equal to 0, and that is a must. What's the a value? -1. A is the number in front of the x squared term. It never, ever, 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 ever includes the x because we're solving for x. None of those letters include x's. We were trying to isolate x. It's already here. What's the b value? -2. Include the sign. Our b value is -2. What's the c value? 4. +4 is the c value, the constant term on the end. Now, what we're going to do is a couple of things. First, we're going to do the discriminant, the thing underneath the radical. We're going to use our calculators. So have your calculator out, and we're going to take our b and we're going to square it. What's our b value? -2. -2 is our b value, and we're going to square it. You absolutely must have parentheses. Don't try to shortcut this, ladies and gentlemen. -4 times a, our a value is -1, times c, which is 4. So in your calculator, right now, you're plugging in with parentheses, -2, quantity squared, -4 times -1 times 4. And if you plug it in using your calculator correctly, if you're using parentheses, you'll get it right every time. If you don't use parentheses, you will get it wrong most of the time. Okay? So use the parentheses. What do you get for your value of the discriminant? 20. So I'm going to plug that in. Here we have the opposite of b. Remember, it's not -b, it's opposite of b. What's our b value? -2. What's the opposite of b? +2. +2 plus or minus the square root of. Underneath the radical, what am I putting in? 20. That's my 20. Everything under the radical made a 20. And then in my denominator, I have 2 times a. What's 2 times a? The a is -1. We want 2 times -1, which is -2. And we have to simplify. So that's the bulk of it. The simplify is the step that most people mess up. So pay attention. To simplify, I have my 2 and my plus or minus. I need to simplify my radical 20. How can I break apart radical 20? 4 times 5. And so we can say, what's the square root of 4? 2. I can't do anything with the radical 5, so it stays underneath the radical. And then to reduce properly, God bless you, this -2 divides both terms. So I lovingly like to say divide and conquer. Split it up and reduce your fractions if you can. What is 2 divided by -2? -1. And then, this is kind of interesting. We have a plus or minus divided by a negative. Well, what this really means is it's like a +2 divided by a -2. What's positive divided by negative? Negative. But then it's also negative 2 divided by negative 2. What's negative 2 divided by negative 2? Positive. It turns out when we have a plus or minus and we divide it by a negative, it ends up still being plus or minus. All right, so it doesn't really change at all, which is nice. And then we can reduce our 2 into 2 goes into 2 one time. So we get 1 radical 5 or just radical 5. Negative 1 plus or minus radical 5. Hopefully you'll get really good at this and can do it really, really quickly. All right, let's try the next one. 5x squared plus 3x minus 1 equals 0. What's our A value? What's the A? 5. What's the B? 3. And what's the C value? Negative 1. So I'm going to take those values and plug them into my quadratic formula, which is the x equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. The first thing I'm going to do is figure out what b squared minus 4ac is in my calculator. B squared would be 3 squared minus 4 times a times c times 5 times negative 1. So I'm plugging that into my calculator. Make sure you use parentheses. Parentheses are just going to ensure that you do it correctly every single time instead of half the time. So using parentheses, I get 29 under the radical. All right, so we have x equals, what is the opposite of b? Opposite of b? Negative 3. Opposite of b. B is 3. The opposite would be negative 3. Plus or minus the square root of, what goes under my square root? 29. And then in my denominator, I have 2 times a. What's 2 times a? 10. 2 times 5. 2 times 5 gives me the 10. Can I simplify radical 29 at all? Are there any perfect squares in there? No, it's prime. The only thing I can do to simplify, since I can't change my radical, is split up my denominator. Divide each term by 10. Nothing changes. These are identical answers. Both of these are great answers. I'm just always going to encourage you to separate that denominator so you can reduce properly if it comes up. All right, this one didn't reduce, so it's kind of a nice and easy one. Okay? Sometimes they reduce and sometimes they don't. Questions on those two? All right, last two. What's wrong with these two? They're not equal to 0. They're not equal to 0, so to get started, we want to add 4 to both sides on this first one. So we have x squared plus 4x plus 4 equals 0. What's my a value? 1. There's a 1 in front of the x squared. That's the a. B is 4, and c is also 4. Write down my formula. X equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. I hope you sing that in your sleep tonight. All right. Under the radical is the discriminant. I'm going to put that in my calculator. B squared. B is 4. 4 squared minus 4 times A times C. You're going to plug that into your calculator. And you get 0, yeah. 16 minus 16 is 0. It happens. All right, I have x equals. What is the opposite of my b value? -4. Right now it's +4. The opposite would be -4. Plus or minus the square root of 0. All divided by 2 times a. What's 2 times a? Just 2. 2 times 1 is 2. What is the square root of 0? Yeah, 0, which means I don't care about it. It's just 0, which is really nice. That whole plus or minus thing disappears because it's 0. So it just leaves me with -4 over 2, which equals -2. There's just one solution. When our discriminant is equal to 0, there is only one solution. Instead of having that plus or minus thing, which gives us multiple solutions, 2 solutions. All right, letter D. What's wrong with letter D? It's not equal to 0. So what do you guys want to do? Subtract x squared. Hey, that's an excellent idea. I can move the x squared over. That would work just fine. So I'm going to subtract x squared. Works just fine. So -x squared plus 2x minus 3. What's the a value? What's the value of a? -1. The number in front is a -1. What's the b value? 2. And the c value? -3. All right. X equals the opposite of b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And again, maybe you can shortcut that a lot. You can do a lot of this on your calculator and just write down answers. So in my calculator, b squared would be 2 squared minus 4 times a times c. So 2 squared minus 4 times -1 times -3. So plugging that in your calculator, lots of parentheses. What do you get? -8. Very good. What happens when you have a negative under a radical? Imaginary solutions. When our discriminant is negative, we're going to get imaginary solutions. All right. What is the opposite of b? -2 plus or minus the square root of what goes under our radical? -8. And then 2 times a. What's 2 times a? -2. 2 times -1 gives me -2. Just going to do a little bit of cleanup. My radical can simplify. A can break apart into 4 times 2. What happens when I have a negative under the radical? What do we get? I did. And the square root of 4 is 2. And a radical 2 stays under the radical. And then I'm going to divide each term by -2. And if you do that and reduce, you'll do it correctly every single time. What's -2 divided by -2? 1 plus or minus, and again, 2 divided by 2 reduces to 1i radical 2. Do you need that 1 in front of the I? No. If you have 1 plus or minus I radical 2, that's the same thing. All right. Oh, God. Oh man, you came to England. Okay. Oh, are there two of them? Oh, okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen, do you have any questions for me? All right, you. Class practice 55, 31 through 41 odd on page 295. Yeah, grab the help. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I have two worksheets I'm going to pass out to you. This first one, this is an extra credit assignment, like I normally give on the class website. So it's also on the class website, but I have a hard copy if you want it. And then the other one is the review. The review is due on Tuesday. It's always a good idea to start it because it's not short, so it will take some time. You will get to work on it on Monday. Do not lose it. Extra credit?
Oh, sure.
Oh, okay. Extra credit. Both sides. Here is the extra credit. Is the Not ready. Extra credit. Extra credit.
Miss. No, it's still recording.
Yeah, oh, still recording. Thanks.
You didn't get the extra credit?
Wait, there's a review coming.